The manager of a high-end boutique humiliatingly kicked Michelle Obama out, but her return came as a real shock to everyone. What happened next changed the way they saw the world. Subscribe to the channel and share in the comments where you are watching this video from. The sun was just beginning to rise over the bustling streets of Manhattan, its light reflecting off the glass skyscrapers that lined the avenues. Morning commuters hurried along the sidewalks, their footsteps echoing in rhythmic unison as taxis honked and vendors called out their wares. Amid the energy of the city, nestled between high-end cafes and luxury boutiques, stood an establishment that seemed to exude an almost ethereal exclusivity. Its name, embossed in gold on a sleek black plaque, was synonymous with prestige and unattainable luxury. Inside the boutique, the atmosphere was a stark contrast to the chaos outside. Marble floors stretched out in every direction, reflecting the soft glow of crystal chandeliers. The scent of expensive candles lingered in the air, subtle but intentional, an invisible marker of wealth. Mannequins stood like sentinels, draped in garments that could fund a year of college tuition. The staff moved gracefully, their every step rehearsed, their voices muted to match the hushed reverence of the space. This was not a place for browsing. It was a sanctuary for the ultra-rich, a temple to consumerism. Near the entrance, a pair of sales associates stood behind a glass counter displaying diamond-encrusted jewelry. Their tailored uniforms and polished appearances radiated a practiced perfection. One of them, a man in his early 30s, leaned slightly toward the other, lowering his voice just enough to maintain the illusion of professionalism. "Did you see the new shipment? That emerald clutch, absolutely breathtaking," he murmured, his tone dripping with curated enthusiasm. "Only 3 in the world," his colleague replied with a knowing smirk. "I've already got 2 appointments lined up. Can you imagine someone walking in off the street and asking for it?" They shared a quiet chuckle, the kind reserved for those who believed themselves above reproach. The boutique's door opened with a soft chime, interrupting their conversation. Heads turned instinctively, as they always did when someone entered. The figure that stepped inside, however, did not fit the archetype of their usual clientele. She wore a simple gray cardigan over a white blouse, paired with comfortable jeans and a pair of worn sneakers. Her hair was pulled back in a loose bun, and her only accessory was a practical leather tote slung over one shoulder. Michelle Obama had come in search of a gift. The former First Lady moved with a quiet confidence, her presence commanding attention despite her understated appearance. She glanced around the boutique, taking in the displays with the same thoughtful consideration she brought to any public space. Yet, instead of the warm reception she might have expected, she was met with a palpable chill. The man behind the counter narrowed his eyes slightly, masking his judgment behind a polite facade. To him, she was an anomaly, a woman who did not belong. He exchanged a quick glance with his colleague before stepping forward to intercept her. His smile was polite, but there was an edge to it, like a blade hidden in velvet. "Good morning," he greeted her. "Can I help you with something today?" Michelle smiled graciously, oblivious, or perhaps choosing to ignore, the subtle condescension in his tone. "Good morning. I'm looking for a special gift, something elegant but meaningful, perhaps a handbag or a piece of jewelry." The man hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes darting to her shoes before snapping back to her face. "Of course," he said smoothly, though his smile tightened. "Our collection is very exclusive. Most of our pieces are one of a kind, May I ask what sort of budget you're working with? The question, though seemingly innocuous, carried an undercurrent of doubt. Michelle's expression didn't falter, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, a recognition, perhaps, of the barriers she'd faced so many times before. "I'd prefer to see the collection first," she replied evenly, maintaining her poise. "Then we can discuss specifics." "Of course," the man repeated, but his tone had shifted. He stepped aside, gesturing toward the main showroom with a practiced flourish. As she moved past him, he cast a glance toward his colleague, who raised an eyebrow in silent communication. Michelle began to browse, her eyes scanning the displays with genuine interest. She paused in front of a glass case housing a series of handbags, each more ornate than the last. One in particular caught her attention, a sleek design in emerald green leather with gold accents. It was both striking and timeless, the kind of piece that could make a statement without shouting. "This one," she said, gesturing to the bag. "May I see it?" The man who had greeted her stepped forward, his movements deliberate. He unlocked the case with a key and carefully removed the bag, placing it on the counter in front of her. As he did, another employee approached, a woman with sharp cheekbones and a clipboard in hand. She surveyed Michelle with a quick, appraising glance before whispering something to her colleague. "Ah," the man said, his tone shifting. "I should mention, this particular piece is from our limited edition collection. It's priced at $75,000. The number hung in the air like a challenge, and for a moment, Michelle wondered if he expected her to recoil. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, her expression calm. "It's beautiful," she said. "What else can you tell me about it?" The man hesitated, caught off guard by her composure. Before he could respond, the woman with the clipboard interjected. "It's a favorite among our long-standing clients," she said, her voice tinged with a sweetness that felt insincere. "We usually reserve it for appointments. Were you referred to us by someone?" Michelle turned to face her, her gaze steady. "No," she replied simply. "I walked in." The woman's smile faltered, but she recovered quickly. "I see," she said, her tone cool. "Well, we're happy to assist you. Just keep in mind that our inventory moves quickly, and most of our clients prefer to finalize purchases immediately." There it was again, the assumption, the unspoken dismissal cloaked in civility. Michelle felt a familiar heat rising in her chest, a mix of frustration and determination. She had come here for a simple purpose, and yet she was being tested, her worthiness evaluated by people who knew nothing about her. As the interaction continued, she noticed the subtle glances exchanged between the staff, the whispered comments just out of earshot. It wasn't the first time she'd been underestimated, but it still stung. She took a deep breath, reminding herself of the lessons her parents had instilled in her. Grace under pressure, dignity in the face of disrespect. For now, she would let it go. But something told her this encounter was far from over. The chapter ends with Michelle stepping deeper into the boutique, unaware that the tension brewing around her would soon escalate into something far more confrontational. Michelle continued her quiet exploration of the boutique, her gaze trailing over the meticulously arranged displays. Each item seemed to demand attention, from the shimmering necklaces to the delicately stitched leather handbags. The air was heavy with an unspoken rule. Everything in this space was meant to awe, to dazzle, to intimidate. Yet, as she moved between the vitrines, the unease in the room grew more palpable. The sales staff were watching her now, their gazes barely veiled behind professional smiles and hushed conversations. She paused near a stand of scarves, her fingers brushing lightly against the silk fabric of a vibrant, hand-painted piece. The texture was exquisite, the craftsmanship undeniable. Michelle admired the artistry for a moment before glancing up to catch one of the sales associates whispering to her colleague. They glanced at her, exchanged a subtle laugh, and quickly turned away, pretending to straighten a display. Her smile tightened, but she refused to react. Years in the public eye had taught her the art of composure, and she wasn't about to falter now. Still, their laughter lingered like an unpleasant echo in the back of her mind. She moved toward the counter where the emerald handbag still rested, its gold clasp gleaming under the soft lights. The male associate, the one who had greeted her, returned to her side. His smile was practiced, but his eyes betrayed his thoughts, an unmistakable judgment. He gestured toward the handbag with a theatrical flourish, as if presenting it to a royal court. "Have you decided, ma'am?" he asked, his tone laced with false courtesy. "It's a unique piece, truly one of a kind." "It's beautiful," Michelle replied, her voice steady. "Could you tell me more about its design, the craftsmanship?" The man hesitated for a fraction of a second, clearly unprepared for her interest in the specifics. "Well," he began, fumbling slightly, "it's handcrafted in Italy. The leather is sourced from a family-owned tannery that has been in operation for centuries. The gold hardware is exclusive, I'm sure," Michelle finished, her tone neutral but pointed. She let her gaze linger on his face, watching him squirm under her calm scrutiny. "Precisely," he said, recovering quickly. "We only offer such pieces to clients who truly appreciate their value. May I ask if you'd like to proceed with the purchase today?" Michelle caught the faint emphasis on the word today, a subtle insinuation that her interest might not translate into action. Before she could respond, the female associate with the clipboard approached, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. Her expression was polite but distant, as though she were addressing a wayward guest at an exclusive event. "Excuse me," the woman said, glancing at her colleague before turning to Michelle. "I just want to ensure that you're aware of our policies. Items from this collection are reserved for clientele with established purchase histories. It helps us maintain the exclusivity of our brand." The words were delivered with a disarming smile, but their intent was clear. Michelle felt the heat rise in her chest, but she forced herself to remain composed. She met the woman's gaze directly, refusing to look away. "I see," Michelle said slowly. "And what exactly does an established purchase history entail?" The woman hesitated, clearly unprepared for the question. "It's just a way of ensuring that our clients are aligned with the brand's values and standards," she said, her tone growing more strained. Michelle's calm facade remained intact, but inside her frustration was mounting. She had faced countless subtle and not-so-subtle instances of discrimination in her life, but each one stung anew. She thought about the young people she had mentored, the stories they had shared of being judged unfairly because of how they looked or where they came from. This moment, she realized, was no different. "I'd like to see the bag again," she said, her voice firm. "If it's not too much trouble." The male associate, clearly uncomfortable, exchanged a quick glance with the woman before reaching for the bag. He placed it on the counter in front of her, his movements overly cautious, as if he feared she might damage it simply by proximity. Michelle studied the bag closely, her fingers tracing the fine stitching along the edges. She wasn't thinking about the price tag or even the practicality of the item anymore. What mattered now was standing her ground, refusing to be dismissed. She turned to the man, her expression calm but unyielding. "I'll take it," she said. The words hung in the air, silencing the faint murmur of conversations nearby. The male associate blinked, clearly caught off guard. The woman with the clipboard raised an eyebrow, her polite mask slipping for a moment before she quickly recovered. "Of course," the man said, forcing a smile. "Let me prepare the paperwork for you." He turned and walked toward the back counter, but Michelle could feel the weight of their judgment pressing against her like a tangible force. The whispers started again, low and furtive, but she caught fragments of their conversation. "Is she serious?" one voice said. "She doesn't look like she can afford it," another replied. Michelle clenched her jaw, her patience wearing thin. She had come here for something simple, a gift, a moment of quiet joy in a place she should have felt welcome. Instead, she was being scrutinized, judged, and belittled. The male associate returned, holding a clipboard with a form clipped neatly to the top. "If you could just provide some information," he said, his tone overly sweet. "We'll also need a credit check before finalizing the purchase." Michelle stared at him, her expression hardening. A credit check? In all her years, she had never been subjected to such a demand. It was an insult, thinly veiled as policy. "I don't think that will be necessary," she said coldly. The man hesitated, clearly unsure of how to proceed. Before he could respond, the woman with the clipboard stepped forward again, her voice dripping with feigned concern. "We simply want to ensure a smooth transaction," she said. "You understand, I'm sure." Michelle's composure finally cracked, though only slightly. Her voice was calm, but there was steel in her tone. "What I understand," she said, "is that you've made an assumption about me based on nothing more than how I look. That's not policy. That's prejudice." The woman opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. For a moment, the tension in the room was almost suffocating. Then, the male associate cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Perhaps we should," he began, but Michelle didn't let him finish. "I think I've seen enough," she said, straightening her shoulders. She turned on her heel and walked toward the exit, her steps deliberate and measured. Behind her, the whispers grew louder, but she didn't look back. As the boutique's door closed behind her, the cool air of the city rushed over her, washing away some of the tension. But the sting of their judgment lingered, sharp and unforgiving. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The streets of Manhattan buzzed with their usual frenetic energy. The distant hum of traffic and the occasional shout from a street vendor creating a lively soundtrack that contrasted starkly with the sterile silence inside the boutique. Michelle stood just outside the door for a moment, collecting herself, trying to calm the swirling storm of emotions churning within her. She had faced public challenges, endured harsh criticism, and even stood up to world leaders. But there was something uniquely insidious about this type of subtle, socially sanctioned discrimination that felt particularly dehumanizing. She inhaled deeply, the cool air filling her lungs, and then stepped back through the boutique's doors, determined to confront what had just happened. The door chimed softly as it closed behind her, and several heads turned in her direction. The sales associates, some of whom had laughed at her earlier, paused in their tasks. Their eyes followed her, their expressions a mix of curiosity, surprise, and in some cases, irritation. Michelle moved with purpose, her head held high, her eyes scanning the room until they settled on the male associate who had served her earlier. He seemed momentarily stunned by her return, his eyes widening slightly before he quickly masked his reaction behind a practiced smile. He started to move towards her, but before he could reach her, Michelle spoke, her voice ringing out across the room, firm and clear. "I want to speak with the manager," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. The male associate hesitated, the color draining from his face. He glanced toward the back of the store, where the female associate with the clipboard was watching, her expression unreadable. She stepped forward, her heels clicking against the marble floor, her posture stiff. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. Michelle turned to face her, her gaze steady. "Yes, there is a problem. The way I was treated here today was completely unacceptable. I came in looking to make a purchase, but instead, I was subjected to a level of scrutiny and disrespect that I would not expect anywhere, let alone in a place that claims to value its clients." The woman blinked, clearly taken aback by Michelle's directness. She hesitated, her eyes darting around the room as if looking for support from her colleagues. Several of the other associates had stopped what they were doing, their attention fixed on the confrontation unfolding before them. The air seemed to grow heavier, the tension almost palpable. "I assure you, ma'am, we have policies in place to ensure that our clients receive the best possible service," the woman began, her voice strained. "We have to maintain certain standards." Michelle cut her off, her voice calm but laced with steel. "Standards that apparently include making assumptions about people based on their appearance. Tell me, what about me suggested that I wasn't worthy of being treated with respect?" The female associate opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her carefully curated professionalism seemed to crumble under Michelle's unwavering gaze. She looked to her colleague, who had taken a few cautious steps back, as if trying to distance himself from the unfolding scene. "Perhaps it would be better if you left," the woman finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Michelle raised an eyebrow, a small, incredulous smile tugging at her lips. "You want me to leave?" she asked, her tone disbelieving. She took a step forward, her presence seeming to fill the space around her. "Is this how you handle situations when your staff mistreats someone? By asking the victim to leave?" The woman flinched at the word victim, her composure cracking further. She glanced around, clearly uncomfortable, her eyes pleading silently for someone to step in and take control. But no one moved. The rest of the staff remained frozen, caught between curiosity and fear of involving themselves. The male associate finally stepped forward, his expression tight. "We don't want any trouble," he said, his voice tense. "We have other customers to serve, and this isn't the type of environment we want to foster." Michelle let out a short laugh, the sound filled with a mix of disbelief and frustration. "You think I'm the one causing trouble?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. "All I wanted was to make a purchase, but instead, I was made to feel as though I was trespassing, like I wasn't good enough to even step foot in this place." The male associate shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flickering to the other customers who were now watching intently, some with raised eyebrows, others whispering behind their hands. The female associate cleared her throat, clearly attempting to regain control of the situation. "Ma'am, we reserve the right to refuse service to anyone," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Michelle shook her head slowly, her eyes narrowing. "That's not what this is about, and you know it. You didn't refuse me service because I was causing trouble. You refused me service because of your own assumptions, because I don't fit your idea of what a worthy client looks like." The tension in the room was electric, the silence stretching out for what felt like an eternity. Finally, the female associate seemed to snap, her face flushing with a mix of anger and embarrassment. She took a step forward, her voice rising in frustration. "Please leave, ma'am. We don't need a scene here," she said, her tone harsh. Michelle looked at her, her eyes filled with a calm defiance that seemed to unsettle the other woman. She held the associate's gaze for a long moment before finally nodding, her lips curving into a tight smile. "Fine," she said, her voice low but firm. "But know this. This isn't over. You can't keep treating people like this and expect no consequences. The world is watching, and people deserve to know how they'll be treated when they walk through those doors." With that, she turned on her heel, her stride deliberate and purposeful as she moved toward the exit. The air seemed to crackle with the weight of the moment, the tension almost suffocating. As she reached the door, she glanced back over her shoulder, her gaze sweeping across the room, taking in the stunned faces of the staff and the curious, wide-eyed expressions of the other customers. Without another word, she pushed open the door, the chime ringing out softly as she stepped back into the bustling streets of Manhattan. The cool air rushed to meet her, a stark contrast to the oppressive atmosphere she had just left behind. She paused for a moment, closing her eyes and taking in a deep breath, trying to steady herself. The pain and frustration she felt were familiar, but that didn't make them any easier to bear. She had faced prejudice before, more times than she cared to remember, but the sting of being dismissed and judged so casually still left a bitter taste in her mouth. The encounter had stripped away the veneer of composure she worked so hard to maintain, leaving her raw, exposed. She knew that this wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever been made to feel less than because of their appearance, their background, their race. It was about the systemic prejudice that was woven into the very fabric of places like that boutique. Places that hid behind a facade of exclusivity and prestige while fostering an environment of exclusion. Michelle opened her eyes, her gaze focusing on the bustling street in front of her. She could see people moving with purpose, going about their lives, unaware of the storm raging inside her. But she wouldn't let this moment pass in silence. This time she would use her voice, not just for herself, but for all those who had been treated the same way. This was not the end. It was only the beginning of something larger, something that needed to be addressed. She pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she typed out a message to a close contact, someone she trusted. She knew she had the platform to bring attention to this, to shine a light on the kind of treatment that so many people faced but rarely had the means to challenge. And she intended to do exactly that. As she began walking, her steps purposeful, she could already feel the resolve building within her. This wouldn't be another moment of silent indignation. She had the power to make a difference, and she wasn't going to let this opportunity slip away. The boutique's pristine facade might have remained intact, but the truth of what lay beneath was about to be exposed. This was just the beginning. That evening, after the door of the boutique had closed behind her, Michelle sat in her living room, the comforting familiarity of home doing little to ease the churn of emotions inside her. She stared at the soft glow of the fireplace, her thoughts still echoing with the biting words of the boutique staff. The disdain in their eyes, the condescending tone, the outright dismissal. This was an experience she had hoped was behind her, one she had faced growing up in the South Side of Chicago, one that she knew too many people still faced every single day. The evening light filtered in through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the room, and Michelle found herself unable to let the events of the day slip into the past. She had the means now, the voice, and the influence to make a difference, to highlight the insidious nature of everyday discrimination that still plagued places meant to symbolize luxury and prestige. With this thought in mind, she reached for her phone and began typing a message to her closest ally, her partner and confidant, Barack. "Had an awful experience today," she wrote. "Went to buy a gift, but instead I got a stark reminder of what some people think I deserve." The response came quickly, as she knew it would. Barack had a way of supporting her without questioning her feelings, understanding without her having to elaborate. His message was simple, yet it carried the weight of everything they had been through together. "Let's talk about it tonight. Whatever you need to do, I'm with you." She smiled faintly, feeling a little bit of the tension dissipate. They talked that night, long after the house had grown quiet and the lights had dimmed. She described every detail, every sneer, every dismissive look. She talked about the indignity of being asked for a credit check as if she were some interloper instead of a genuine customer. Barack listened, nodding, his brow furrowing in frustration but his voice calm and reassuring. "You can't let this slide, Mish," he said, taking her hand. "You have the power to make sure this doesn't just become another untold story of someone being mistreated because of who they are. We can shine a light on this." Michelle nodded, her determination hardening into resolve. She knew he was right. She had always believed that silence was complicity, that change could only come when people had the courage to speak up. This wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever been made to feel unworthy. Every person who had ever faced prejudice hidden behind a polished smile. The next day, Michelle began making phone calls. She reached out to a few close contacts, journalists and activists she trusted. People who understood the importance of telling stories that expose the truth. She shared her experience, and to her relief, they understood immediately what needed to be done. They talked about the power of visibility, how shining a spotlight on even the smallest acts of prejudice could ripple outwards, affecting change on a much larger scale. "We should make a statement," one of the journalists suggested. "Go back there. Let the cameras capture it. Not just your story, but the bigger picture of how these places operate." It was a bold idea, and Michelle knew it would be controversial. There would be those who would criticize her for making a scene, for using her position to draw attention to herself. But she also knew that there were countless people who would see themselves in her experience, who would feel seen and heard because of her actions. That was reason enough to proceed. The plans moved quickly. The journalists arranged for a small camera crew to be ready, discreet but effective, and Michelle made her preparations. She was going back to that boutique, not as an individual customer, but as a representative of every person who had ever been treated as less than. On the day of her return, the weather had turned overcast, a thick layer of gray clouds hanging over the city. It matched her mood, somber, determined, and resolute. Michelle dressed deliberately that morning. She chose a simple but elegant dress, one that exuded confidence without being ostentatious. She wanted her presence to speak for itself, not the designer labels or the price tags. The ride to the boutique was quiet. The journalists rode with her, speaking in hushed tones about how they would proceed, the questions they would ask, the footage they hoped to capture. Michelle listened, nodding occasionally, but her mind was elsewhere, on the young people who would watch this, the ones who faced this kind of discrimination every day without the platform to call it out. This was for them. The boutique loomed ahead, its gleaming windows reflecting the muted gray of the sky. Michelle took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the handle of her purse as she stepped out of the car. The camera crew moved into position, and she could see the surprised expressions of passers-by as they recognized her, some pulling out their phones to record the scene. She ignored them, her focus on what lay ahead. The door chimed softly as she entered, just as it had the day before. The same marble floors, the same opulent displays. But this time, there was something different in the air, a tension that hadn't been there before. The sales associates looked up, their eyes widening in shock as they recognized her. A few exchanged nervous glances, clearly unsure of how to proceed. The female associate with the clipboard was the first to react, stepping forward, her expression carefully neutral. "Good morning," she said, her voice tight. "How can we help you today?" Michelle met her gaze evenly, her voice carrying across the room with calm authority. "I'm here to talk about what happened yesterday. I think it's important that people see how you treat potential customers who don't fit your preconceived notions." The woman blinked, her composure faltering for just a moment before she forced a smile. "I'm not sure what you mean," she said, her tone defensive. "We treat all of our customers with the utmost respect." "Do you?" Michelle asked, her voice unwavering. She gestured to the cameras, which had moved in closer, capturing every detail. "Because what I experienced yesterday was anything but respectful. I was judged, dismissed, and ultimately asked to leave, not because of my behavior, but because of how I look." The woman's eyes flickered to the cameras, her discomfort evident. She glanced at her colleagues, who were watching from behind the counters, their expressions ranging from confusion to fear. One of the male associates, the one who had served Michelle the day before, took a hesitant step forward, his face pale. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," he said, his voice wavering. "You were only trying to uphold your brand's standards," Michelle cut in, her tone sharp. "But let's be clear. Those standards are rooted in prejudice. You judged me because I didn't fit your idea of what a worthy client should look like, and I'm here today to make sure that everyone knows that." The room fell silent, the tension thick and suffocating. The female associate looked as though she wanted to disappear, her face flushing red as she struggled for a response. The male associate's gaze dropped to the floor, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Michelle turned to the cameras, her voice steady, her words deliberate. "This isn't just about me. This is about every person who has ever walked into a store like this and been made to feel unwelcome, unworthy. It's about the quiet prejudice that exists in places like this, the kind that people rarely see but that affects so many of us." She paused, her eyes sweeping across the room, taking in the stunned faces of the staff, the curious onlookers who had gathered outside the boutique's windows. "I hope that by being here today, by speaking up, we can start to change that. Because everyone deserves to be treated with respect, no matter who they are or what they look like." With those words, Michelle turned and walked toward the exit, the cameras following her, capturing every step. She could hear the faint murmur of voices behind her, the shock and disbelief, but she didn't look back. This wasn't about confrontation for its own sake. This was about shining a light on something that needed to be seen. Outside, the crowd had grown. People standing on the sidewalk, their phones raised, recording the scene. Michelle paused for a moment, turning to face them, her expression calm but resolute. "Change starts with us," she said, her voice carrying over the murmur of the crowd. "It starts with speaking up, with refusing to accept things the way they are. We have to demand better. From our businesses, from each other, from ourselves." The crowd was silent for a moment, and then, slowly, a ripple of applause began, growing louder and more insistent until it filled the street. Michelle smiled, a real smile this time, one that reached her eyes. She nodded, then turned and made her way to the car, the applause following her, echoing in her ears as she had left the boutique, and its prejudice behind. This was just the beginning. The air felt charged as Michelle sat quietly in the car on her way to the boutique, replaying the plans in her mind. This time, she wasn't alone. The small convoy of cars behind her carried a television crew, journalists and activists, people who understood the stakes, people who understood the power of visibility. This was not just a simple confrontation. It was a chance to shine a light on a problem that went deeper than a single incident. The gray sky hung heavy over Manhattan as they approached the familiar building. The boutique, with its polished facade and luxurious displays, appeared almost innocuous on the bustling street, another symbol of the exclusive world it catered to. But Michelle knew better. She knew what lay beneath the glamorous veneer. A culture that dismissed, judged, and discriminated against those who didn't fit an arbitrary mold. As her car pulled up, the journalists began setting up. The camera crew assembled quickly and efficiently, understanding the gravity of the situation. Michelle stepped out of the vehicle, her expression serious but calm, her dress understated but elegant. She wanted to look like herself, like the woman who had once lived in the White House, but also like the woman who knew the streets of the South Side of Chicago, who understood firsthand what it meant to be underestimated. There was a quiet murmur among the people gathered nearby, some bystanders, some passers-by who had paused, curious about the cameras and the small group assembling in front of the boutique. She noticed a few people pull out their phones, their faces a mix of surprise and anticipation. She took a deep breath, her fingers brushing across the notes she had prepared, though she knew she wouldn't need them. This confrontation had been living in her mind for the past day, playing out over and over. As she walked to the door, the soft chime echoed just as it had the day before. But this time the tension was different, charged, deliberate. The boutique's pristine interior seemed to shrink under the intensity of the moment. The air growing thick with apprehension, Michelle walked in, flanked by journalists, the cameras rolling, capturing every moment. She saw the staff freeze in their places, recognizing her immediately. Their eyes widened, and they exchanged anxious glances as they realized what was happening. This was not the discreet visit of a single customer. It was something much bigger. The woman with the clipboard, the same one who had dismissed her with veiled politeness the day before, stepped forward, her eyes darting from Michelle to the cameras, a hint of panic in her expression. "Good morning, ma'am," she said, her voice uncertain, the rehearsed professionalism now shaky. "How can we assist you today?" Michelle faced her, her expression resolute, her voice carrying authority without raising it. "I'm here today to talk about the way your staff treated me yesterday. I think it's important that people see how businesses like yours operate, how you treat customers who might not fit your preconceived ideas of who deserves respect. The woman's smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of fear. "Ma'am, we strive to provide excellent service to all of our customers," she began, her tone defensive, as she glanced nervously at the cameras. There must have been some misunderstanding. Michelle shook her head slowly. "No, there was no misunderstanding. Yesterday, I came in here as a potential customer, just like anyone else. I was ignored, belittled, and ultimately asked to leave. All because you decided I didn't belong here. Not because of my behavior, but because of my appearance." The boutique seemed to grow smaller as silence fell across the room, the words hanging heavily in the air. Several other associates were standing by, their expressions ranging from discomfort to outright alarm. The male associate, the one who had spoken to her yesterday, stepped forward hesitantly, his gaze flickering between Michelle and the cameras. "We didn't mean to. It wasn't like that," he said, his voice trembling slightly. We have policies, you see." "Policies?" Michelle interrupted, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Policies that determine who gets treated with dignity and who doesn't. Is that what you mean by policies?" The male associate looked down, his face turning pale. The woman with the clipboard took a step back, clearly wanting to extricate herself from the situation but unable to. One of the journalists moved forward, her camera focused on Michelle, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Mrs. Obama, could you clarify what you believe the issue to be here? For the viewers at home, what message are you hoping to send today?" Michelle turned slightly to face the journalist, her gaze unwavering. "The issue here isn't just about me. What happened to me yesterday is a reflection of a larger problem, a systemic issue that affects people all across this country. It's about the quiet, pervasive prejudice that's still present in our society, the kind that tells people they're not good enough based on nothing more than how they look or what they're wearing. It's about exclusivity that's used as a shield for discrimination." She paused, her eyes sweeping across the boutique, taking in the stunned, uneasy faces of the staff. Places like this present themselves as temples of luxury, open only to a chosen few, and they get to decide who's worthy of entering those doors. Yesterday, I was told, indirectly but clearly, that I was not one of those people, and I know I'm not alone in that experience. There was a ripple of murmurs among the bystanders, the journalists scribbling notes, the cameras clicking. The woman with the clipboard shifted uncomfortably, her face flushed. She tried to speak, but Michelle didn't give her the chance. "I'm not here for an apology," Michelle said, her voice firm but not harsh. "An apology won't change what happened yesterday, and it won't change what happens in boutiques, restaurants, and other places like this every day. What I want is for people to see this, to understand that the quiet discrimination that people face in spaces like these is real and harmful." She gestured to the camera. "This isn't about making a scene. It's about making sure that people are held accountable. It's about creating spaces where everyone, regardless of their race, background, or the way they look, is treated with respect." The male associate swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the room, clearly unsure of how to respond. The woman with the clipboard opened her mouth, but no words came out. There was nothing left to say. Michelle looked at them, her expression softening slightly. "It's not too late to change. It's not too late to look at the way you do things here, to reconsider the way you see people. Because if places like this want to remain in business, they have to change. People are watching, and they're not going to accept discrimination in any form. She turned her gaze to the cameras, her voice growing softer but no less impactful. We have a responsibility to call out discrimination when we see it. We have a responsibility to make sure that everyone is treated fairly, with dignity and respect. This is one story, but it's part of a much bigger picture, and it's up to all of us to do better. She held the gaze of the camera for a moment longer, her words resonating in the heavy silence that had fallen over the room. Then she turned, her steps purposeful as she walked toward the door. The journalists moved aside, making way for her, the cameras following her every movement. The soft chime of the door echoed as she stepped out onto the busy Manhattan sidewalk. The crowd that had gathered outside was larger now, people standing with their phones raised, capturing the moment. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, a mix of applause, cheers, and shouts of support. Michelle paused, turning to face the crowd, her expression calm but resolute. She raised her hand slightly, her voice ringing out clearly. Change starts with all of us. Speak up, stand up, and never accept being treated as less than anyone else. Together, we can make a difference. The applause grew louder, spreading down the street, people clapping, cheering, their faces filled with admiration and respect. Michelle smiled, a small but genuine smile that reached her eyes. She nodded to the crowd, then turned and walked toward the car, the noise of the crowd following her, echoing down the streets of Manhattan. Inside the car, as the door closed behind her, she took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. She had done what she needed to do, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel as though they didn't belong. It wasn't the end. It was only a step, one of many steps that still needed to be taken. But it was a start, and that was what mattered. The car pulled away from the curb, and Michelle looked out the window at the city, at the people still standing outside the boutique, their faces turned toward her, their voices raised in support. She knew the road ahead would not be easy. That change took time and effort and persistence. But as she watched the crowd, she felt a renewed sense of hope, because today people had listened. Today people had seen. And today the world felt just a little bit closer to the kind of place it could be, where everyone was treated with the respect they deserved, regardless of what they looked like or where they came from. And for Michelle, that was worth everything. The day after her return to the boutique, the footage of Michelle's confrontation was already making waves across social media and news networks. Clips of her standing firm in the boutique, the journalists capturing her pointed questions, and her final statement to the crowd outside were shared across platforms, accompanied by hashtags like #RespectMatters, #Equality in Retail, and #MichelleSpeaksTruth. People from all corners of the internet weighed in, some expressing outrage, others offering support, many sharing their own stories of similar experiences. The ripple effect was immediate. The boutique, which had once been regarded as an exclusive and prestigious destination for high-end shoppers, suddenly found itself at the center of a storm of criticism. Articles were written, op-eds published, all dissecting the incident, the implications of discrimination, and the broader issues of systemic bias in elite consumer spaces. The boutique's name became synonymous with exclusion, not luxury. The boutique's management quickly realized they needed to act, and by midday, their public relations team had drafted a statement. It was released across their social media channels and posted on their website. a carefully worded apology addressed to Michelle Obama, acknowledging the unfortunate experience she had faced in their store. They promised to improve training, to work towards a more inclusive environment, and to ensure that every customer, regardless of their background, was treated with respect. The statement, though well constructed, was met with skepticism. People in the comments section were quick to call it out as a shallow attempt to protect the brand's image, pointing out that true change required more than just a public apology. Some questioned the authenticity of their promises. Others demanded to see concrete action. But the attention remained on the issue, on how businesses presented themselves versus how they treated real people who did not fit into their narrow definition of ideal clientele. Michelle, meanwhile, sat in her home office, scrolling through the messages she had received. Her social media accounts had been flooded, some with support, others with anger from those who felt she had overstepped. But what struck her the most were the messages from people who had faced similar treatment. They wrote about their experiences, some at luxury stores, others at car dealerships, restaurants, or even hotels. "Thank you for speaking up," one woman had written. "I can't tell you how many times I've walked into places like that and felt invisible. Maybe now they'll see us." Another message from a young man simply said, "I hope one day I can stand up for myself the way you did. Thank you for being a voice for all of us." Michelle set her phone aside, the messages echoing in her mind. She knew this wasn't the end, it was just the beginning of something larger. The response, the public discourse, the conversations that had started because of what happened in that boutique. This was what mattered. It wasn't about punishing the boutique or about forcing an apology. It was about making people aware, about shining a light on the quiet prejudice that so many faced but so few talked about. That afternoon, Michelle received a call from a prominent journalist, someone she had worked with in the past and who understood the importance of advocacy. The journalist suggested taking this momentum and building on it, creating a public forum, a discussion about discrimination in retail and consumer spaces. Michelle agreed, seeing the value in transforming the attention into action. A week later, a virtual town hall was organized. The journalist moderated, and Michelle joined as a featured guest. The discussion was open to the public, and people from across the country tuned in. The forum was more than just an exploration of what had happened at that boutique. It was a broader conversation about systemic prejudice, about the silent ways discrimination continued to exist in spaces that prided themselves on being exclusive. Michelle shared her story once again, but this time she spoke about the many stories she had heard from others since the incident. She read aloud some of the messages she had received, her voice steady but filled with emotion. It was powerful, hearing the real experiences of people whose voices were often ignored. And as the discussion progressed, others began to share their own stories in real time. People called in, their voices trembling as they spoke of times they had felt humiliated, dismissed, unseen. One caller, a middle-aged woman from Atlanta, described how she had been ignored in a luxury jewelry store while staff catered to a white customer who had entered after her. Another young man from Chicago shared how he had been followed around a store by security, made to feel like a criminal simply because of the color of his skin. The stories were painful, but they were also unifying. They highlighted the common threads of experience that tied people together, regardless of where they lived or who they were. Michelle listened, nodding, offering words of encouragement, thanking each person for their bravery in sharing their story. She spoke about how these incidents weren't just isolated events, they were part of a larger pattern, one that needed to be addressed systematically. She emphasized the importance of visibility, of refusing to let these moments pass in silence. "We need to hold people accountable," she said, her voice filled with quiet strength. "And that starts with sharing our experiences. It starts with refusing to be invisible. Change doesn't come from silence. It comes from speaking up, from demanding that we all be treated with dignity and respect." The forum lasted for hours, and by the end, Michelle felt an overwhelming sense of both exhaustion and hope. It was emotionally draining to hear the pain in so many voices, to know that the problem was so widespread. But it was also hopeful, because people were speaking up. They were sharing their stories, demanding better, refusing to accept the status quo, and that, she knew, was how real change began. In the days that followed, the story continued to grow. More news outlets picked up on the forum, highlighting the need for systemic change in how luxury retailers operated. The boutique, now under intense scrutiny, announced a series of initiatives to address unconscious bias among their staff. They promised to bring in diversity consultants, to implement new training programs, steps that, while positive, were largely seen as reactive, a means to salvage their image in the wake of public backlash. But something else began to happen, something far more important. Other businesses started to take notice. Retailers, restaurants, and service providers saw the reaction to the boutique's behavior, saw the public outcry, and began to reflect on their own practices. Several high-profile luxury brands released statements about their commitment to inclusivity, outlining steps they were taking to ensure that all customers were treated fairly. It was clear that the industry, at least in some capacity, was feeling the pressure to change. Michelle watched these developments with cautious optimism. She knew that statements and training programs were only the beginning, that real change would require a cultural shift, a re-examination of the very idea of exclusivity that had been built on the exclusion of others. But she also knew that the conversation had started, that people were paying attention, and that was more than she could have hoped for when she first stepped back into that boutique. Sitting in her office, she began drafting a post for her social media, something to address the outpouring of support and the broader movement that had begun. She wrote about the experience, about the messages she had received, about the town hall, and about the importance of continuing to hold each other accountable. "When we speak up," she wrote, "we make it harder for prejudice to hide. We make it harder for those who would treat others unfairly to do so without consequence. This isn't just about one boutique, one incident. It's about all of us. It's about the world we want to create, the way we want to treat one another. We have to keep demanding better. We have to keep raising our voices. Together, we can make a difference." She paused for a moment, rereading the words before hitting post. She watched as the reactions began to pour in, likes, shares, comments, people adding their voices to hers. It was a small thing, but it was part of something larger. It was a reminder that change didn't happen overnight, but it did happen, one voice at a time, one story at a time. As she leaned back in her chair, a sense of calm settled over her. This wasn't the end. There would be more challenges, more moments of frustration, more battles to fight. But today they had taken a step forward. Today, people were listening, and for Michelle, that was worth everything. She closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself a rare moment of rest. She thought of the young people who had reached out to her, the ones who had said they felt seen because of what she had done. She thought of the people who had shared their stories during the town hall, their voices filled with pain but also with hope. Change was never easy. It was slow, often painful, filled with setbacks and obstacles, but it was happening. She could feel it, see it in the responses, hear it in the voices of those who had found the courage to speak, and that was enough to keep her moving forward, enough to keep her fighting, for herself, for others, for a world that saw everyone as deserving of respect and dignity, because at the end of the day, that was what mattered most. Thank you for watching this video. If you liked it and want more stories like this, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new episodes. Share this video with your friends and family. Together, we can change the way we look at important things. And don't forget that there are many more interesting stories to come, so stay tuned.